Welcome to the Relational Recovery Podcast. I'm your host, Wes Thompson, joined by my co-host, Austin Hill. Today, we're talking about forgiveness. We hope this conversation is helpful. Thanks for listening. Hey, Austin, how are you?
Not bad. How are you doing, Wes?
Good. Good day. Can't complain. Today, I want to talk about forgiveness. I think forgiveness is something important in life, important in recovery, important in relationships. And the first thing to say about forgiveness is it's freaking hard. I think the reality is it's hard. This is one of those two that I'm tempted to kind of brush over it without a definition. But if we were to try to define forgiveness, how would you maybe define it?
Showing someone grace when they do not deserve it. Giving people the benefit of the doubt. And at the same time, it's giving them another opportunity to redeem themselves. But when you have to forgive somebody, it changes the relationship. I think it gets the most mixed up for myself, gauging the difference between consequences and forgiveness. So what I mean by that and why I defined it, like the way I defined it, I think is true, because it's giving somebody the benefit of the doubt, like hoping for a better outcome in the future, but also just being very honest about what actually happened. And then there has to be consequences, and they can look very, very different. But a loving thing is having consequences in a relationship. And a consequence that I think we can all relate to is like broken trust. And then someone forgives you. It's like, all right, I understand. I forgive you for lying to me or deceiving me or manipulating me. But I'm going to be wary and slower to trust you in the future. That's a consequence. That doesn't mean they haven't forgiven you. They now have to process and think through things differently with you. Or you have to do that with somebody else. And that doesn't mean you haven't forgiven somebody. Especially when it's giving people unlimited opportunities for redemption, but that doesn't mean you have to give them unlimited opportunities of redemption. Like for your relationship, we trust that God does that, but that doesn't mean we have to do, because sometimes, like in an abusive relationship, there's a consequence is we have to sever this relationship. That doesn't mean that I haven't forgiven this person, but a consequence is like, I'm not going to be in a relationship with them anymore. That's a consequence.
So there's a difference between forgiveness and consequence. Definitely agree. Because in the cosmic, God theological sense, God, obviously in the Christian tradition, I think of like John 3:16, like for God so loved the world, he gave his son so that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. And this idea that because of what God did on our behalf, we are forgiven. That's kind of this cosmic transcendent forgiveness where we're made right with God. But I think in human relationships, forgiveness, one definition that I read here is like forgiveness is letting go of resentment and anger. Obviously, if we think about it from a Christian worldview, like I'm not God, so I don't have jurisdiction over your soul. So I'm not forgiving you on some cosmic sense, but I think me forgiving you does look a lot like that, like a letting go of resentment, a letting go of anger. To your point, though, that doesn't mean that there aren't consequences. In other words, for example, it would be foolish. I think it would be foolish for me to if I continue to let you harm me, and I justify it by saying, well, I mean, God tells me to forgive. Think of like the battered wife where, she keeps, well, God calls me to forgive, so I need to keep going back and getting, beaten by my spouse. Like that's not healthy.
That's not forgiveness.
Yeah. Like you could choose to forgive, but there still be a separation. There still be a consequence. Like the relationship should change at times. And I think that's what gets, I'm glad you brought that up because I actually wasn't going to go there, but I think that's that's not where my mind went originally, but I think it's a really important nuance because it's something that I think is confusing for people sometimes, whether you're on either side. Like if you're the offender, oftentimes it's like, well, why don't you forgive me? You're putting up a consequence. Do you not forgive? A story I've told you probably numerous times, but it just rings so true that I wrestled with when I was a pastor, which was, there was an individual who had committed a pretty deviant sexual crime years ago in his life. And a leader in the church came to me and said, well, I think this individual should be given keys to the church because this offense happened, X number of time ago. I can't remember how long ago it was, but it had been a good amount of time. But essentially he was like, don't you forgive? And I'm like, I had to wrestle with that. And it's like, well, it was like landing on, there's a difference between forgiving that person and there being consequences. Like because of that past behavior, like I don't trust to give that level of authority because of the behaviors that person exuded in the past. That doesn't mean that I resent them. It doesn't mean that I have anger towards them, but often in life, like there is consequence. I think of even in our, judicial system. I always have a hard time saying that word for some reason. But when I think about, a judge, if somebody comes before the court and we'll just use an extreme example. They murdered someone. Like, I don't think that the public would feel pretty good about them just saying, well, I forgive you. There's no consequence. Like, it doesn't mean that the judge has to harbor anger and resentment. I mean, obviously that would be kind of silly because the offense probably wasn't towards the judge. But my point being, they're oftentimes certain behaviors require consequence. And so that's different than forgiveness. But forgiveness, to come back to just talking about forgiveness and not consequences, forgiveness is hard because I think in many ways forgiveness goes against our nature. We have in us a desire for justice, and we have within us a desire to be right, a desire to see things happen fairly. And in a desire for justice, we can often, when it's easy to get angry, it's easy to resent people and situations that cause us harm. And when somebody, even as simple as just says they'll do something and doesn't do it, we can harbor feelings of resentment towards them, feelings of anger towards them. And I think that's what we're talking about when we're talking about forgiveness, is what do we do with that? Because I think the hard part for many people, and we'll just focus in on people in recovery, I think one of the hard things is not just forgiving other people, but forgiving ourselves. Learning to forgive ourselves, not learning, like being able to not be angry and resentful towards me, because that resentment and anger towards self tends to perpetuate the behavior that made me feel bad in the first place, which becomes a kind of sick cycle, if you will. Like I, maybe I was the worst kind of, like just maybe I was in the throes of addiction and wasn't in my right mind and stole from people that I loved and that loved me and caused them harm. And then I got sober and I got better and I started to change, but I felt terrible and I was angry at myself for that. And because I was angry and resentful at myself for that, I was then trying to find a way to not feel that way and then go back to using again. And again, forgiveness is important in this context because I think that if we don't address it, it can be really tricky.
Yeah. And the messier part of forgiveness, especially with Christians, people who want to follow the ways of Jesus, it's really like we should be the most forgiving. We need to be the most forgiving if we believe in who Jesus is. And that means that we don't give up on people, but we want there to be ways for people to be redeemed. Like, I really hope that's true. I really hope that's true. And I think it is. And for the feeling of being redeemed is only possible when you know you've messed up and someone forgives you, and then you can restore a relationship. And that is something that is really scary, because it requires, like, it's like it comes back again to this fact that God made us for connection, and He knows that we're not perfect, and He puts us in situations, He puts us in a world, in a life where we are going to screw up, where people are going to hurt us and we're going to hurt other people. And forgiveness is something where we actually have the opportunity to grow closer to each other because of the harm that we've done to each other, in spite of the harm we've done to each other, through forgiveness. And it gets messy because we're trying to figure out what is too far. And like, even like in the Bible, Paul, one of the disciples asked Jesus, like, how many times should we forgive somebody, or like, how many times should someone sin? It's like 7 times, but Jesus says it's 7 times 7, or 7 times 70. So it's, there's this, like,
he was basically giving an answer that was a non-answer. He was saying, there isn't a limit to the amount of forgiveness we should extend to ourselves and others.
To forgiveness. And that's like this redemptive power of who Jesus is in our lives, where the one person that that I personally struggle with forgiving the most is myself, because I just want to, like, stop giving myself a break. And that negatively impacts so many different relationships in my life, because I don't accept or receive forgiveness from other people if I can't accept it if I struggle to accept it from myself.
Yeah. It negatively impacts others, and it negatively impacts you.
Because imagine, like, me, it sounds weird, like, I feel like oftentimes when I'm really unhealthy in situations where I don't want to forgive somebody, it's insulting to the person who forgives me. And I'm just like, no, I have to continue to feel bad. I have to continue to, like, be bitter and angry at myself.
To what end, right?
Yeah. The other person's like, dude, just chill out. Like, why are you doing this? Like, you're choosing to be miserable. Like, I forgave you.
I was going to wait to get into practical stuff, but it's just, I can't get it out of my head. I think one practical thing that I try to practice with forgiveness is just, I'm so glad I'm not God, right? I mean, people get so bent out of shape about what everybody in the world's doing. And I try to focus on what I'm responsible for and what I can control. Like, you and I were talking about this recently, and I'll try to keep this very vague, but, like, I don't have the right answer to this, but I do have my own perspective at this moment, which is, hearing about another brother in Christ who'd made some mistakes, and people around this person was like, well, this person shouldn't be able to do X, Y, and Z because of what they did years ago. And I'm like, that doesn't have to do with me. I mean, like, there's times at the Refuge where we have to, like, it's the hardest thing to do, but to let people go, or we have to ask people to leave, or those are things within my control and within my purview, right? There's people in my life that I have to wrestle through forgiveness with. But when I think about how we project on other people in our, whether it's our friend group or whether it's in our city or in our community, and when we start to speak into those issues, like what they deserve and what they don't deserve, again, I could be wrong, but I don't think I am, but that makes me kind of get uncomfortable, because I'm like, it doesn't have to do with me. I don't really feel comfortable being judge, jury, and executioner. And I'm kind of thankful to God that I'm not.
Yeah.
So it's like, when it comes to forgiveness, I talk to a lot of people that struggle because they're like, well, this person did this or that person did that, or look at our government, or look at this. Like, and there's anger and there's resentment, right? And it's like, but if you can't do anything about it, and if it doesn't have to do with your life, and that might sound selfish, and I'm not trying to sound selfish, but literally, if there's nothing you can do about it, then you're extending energy and negative emotion and anger and resentment on things that really are they really? I think a question maybe we should ask ourselves often is like, what's my responsibility here? And if I don't have any, maybe I should focus on trying to repair the things that I do have, influence and responsibility for, rather than worrying about the persons and things that I don't. Frankly, I don't. And leave that with the people that are involved or that are on the ground in that situation, and leave it to the Lord. And there's just a lot of things that we don't have to speak into unless it's in our kind of 20-foot, area of influence. So maybe the point I'm trying to make here is, instead of, when we think about forgiveness, sometimes we think, well, they should forgive me, or they really need forgiveness. It's like, well, let's just start with ourselves. Because I think what you brought up, Austin, is really important. It's like, if we can't forgive ourselves, like, we probably should work on that. And if we're having a hard time forgiving the people closest to us, maybe we should start with those two things.
I think another like way to look at it is questions like, are you like asking yourself and being honest with how you approach forgiveness, where if you look at somebody, it's like, I will forgive that person. Like, I think we all have somebody in mind, or we have multiple people in mind that have really hurt us that we should forgive. And we just haven't done that. And a good way to gauge is like, I don't want to like forgive that person until they feel the way they made me feel. So I'm going to punish them, or I'm going to hurt them the way they hurt me. And the great thing, like the confusing thing about that is like, it's cyclical. So it's not a good way to look at forgiveness. And a consequence doesn't mean I inflict harm on somebody.
No.
So like, if there's a reason why in the Bible God says, vengeance is mine. It's our job to forgive people who've hurt us, to hold people accountable, to make sure that there are like appropriate consequences for things
that are within our responsibility.
Yeah, that are within our responsibility, not trying to go over and beyond. Like, if somebody lied to me, then I will just never talk to that person again, or I will only lie to that person, because that doesn't make sense. I mean, to teach somebody that lying is wrong, I'm only going to lie to them. Like, that doesn't make sense. That's not forgiveness. That's not seeking justice or making things right, because justice is very different than vengeance. Because when we're seeking a biblical consequence is making things right, seeking justice. And making things right is putting things the way they should be. So that is like, forgiveness doesn't often means that like, I have to be okay with somebody not improving, not getting better, but also I have to be okay with the time it takes for me to get to the point where I feel like I can forgive myself. Like, because in order to forgive ourselves, we have to like actually believe that this person, Jesus, came to die for all of our sins to forgive us of those things. Because if we're walking around thinking that like, I'm not forgivable, it's kind of like us walking up to Jesus and just like, you don't need to get on the cross you can get on the cross for everybody else, but not for me. I got this. I can handle this. It's a lack of faith.
You're absolutely right. Yeah. It's pride. It's honestly very prideful.
And it sounds really like humble, and like it can sound humble or look humble, be like, I'm just, I'm worthless. I'm nothing. Like, I just need to sacrifice for other people.
But it's false humility.
Yeah. It's like, you might think it's humility, but it's a skewed understanding of what it is required of us to deserve forgiveness and love from others. We don't have to like hurt ourselves to deserve that.
Yeah, a good example of that is like when my daughter tells me like, oh, nobody loves me. Like, I can do nothing right, which that's a little bit like pity. It's not the same thing necessarily. But even if she said, oh man, like I don't deserve love. I just want to love other people. It's like, as her father, I'm like, that, if you're trying to make me feel good because you're so humble, and I mean, she's 9, so it's a little bit, isn't an apples to apples analogy here, but like, that's not what I want for her. I want her to know she's loved, and I want her to know that no matter what she does, I will be there for her. And I'm a flawed man. And if I feel that way about my daughter, imagine what God, if he sent his own son to suffer on our behalf so that we wouldn't have to suffer, then his love and forgiveness is way bigger and better than mine. And if that's not true, then he's not a God worth serving, right? If that's not true, then he's not a God worth serving. And so the reality is, I don't think God looks at us and like, oh man, I just want you to gravel and feel like a piece of crap. I think at the end, God wants us to know how much we're loved, because if we really know, I believe if we could tolerate, as Rich Plass would often say, if we can tolerate the love of God, that changes everything. That changes everything.
Yeah, because his love is, the thing that we, I think, mess up in forgiveness is we try to be God in the way we forgive, but we're not God. And I think one of my favorite books is Les Mis, and there's a part in the very, like, the first like eighth of it, where the main character, who had just gotten out of prison, he was in prison for 19 years for stealing bread, and he is. So he gets out, he has nothing. He's given a place to stay in this small town, in a church that like a bishop and a couple people live there. And in the night, after they give him a free meal, he steals some valuables from them and runs away, gets caught. And the police bring this guy back, Jean Valjean, back to this bishop's house. And the bishop, when the police like ask the bishop, is this the guy who stole these? He's like, oh no, he forgives him. The bishop forgives Jean Valjean and gives beyond grace to him. He's like, oh, I gave those to you. I gave them to you. I'm sorry, officers. Like, I did give those, but not only that, I'm going to give you even more. And that's not, what's great about that story is it's not just about like this beautiful story of redemption of people. That's how God loves us. It's not like we should let people abuse us. We should let people hurt us. That's not what this is about. It's about an example of God's love towards us. Because there are people, the truth is, and the harsh truth is that there are people in our lives that we will not have relationships with because of the harm we did to them. And there's also people in our lives that because of the things they did to us, we won't have a relationship with them. But that does not mean we should lose hope for them, because it is God who has unlimited grace, unlimited forgiveness for them. It's not our job to be God in all situations. We, like, kind of what we talk about a lot is we have to be responsible for what we can control. And we don't have to be everything to everybody, but it's this hope that we have that everyone can be redeemed to God. That means, like, not to us. That means, like, there's going to be relationships in my life that are not going to heal. There are people that I still don't want to talk to. And that's something that I have to work on.
Well, that's such a good practical example. Yeah, I mean, it's something that you need to work on, I need to work on, but also it's a good example of just the imperfection of this world, and what forgiveness looks like in real life. I could be wrong, but my view is such that I do none of this perfectly, but I'm going to share what my aim is, at least what I try to do. I mean, like you, Austin, there's people in my life that for whatever reason have caused me like people that I was very close with, that caused me great hurt and harm, and that I'm not close to anymore. And I'm sure I know that there's people that feel that way about me. What my aim is in that isn't forgiveness to me doesn't mean that I have to be close to them again. Forgiveness means that I need to get to a place where I pray for their good, and I want them to experience the fullness of joy and flourishing in this life, and that I don't resent them, and that I'm not angry towards them, that I can let it go. And I think that's what forgiveness looks like. It's not that magically everything is what it used to be. Because sometimes in life that may happen for you, and I hope and pray that it does. But sometimes in life, like you said, that doesn't happen. But that doesn't mean that we have to sit around and be like, man, I just wish that they would, die or whatever. Or I just want them to hurt. It's like, no, I think what forgiveness looks like is, even though I may have experienced great harm and pain from them, and they from me, in certain situations, I want to give them to the Lord, and I want to be able to get to a place in my own heart and soul that I want good for them. I'm not going to resent them. I can let it go. I can put the anger down.
Mm-hmm. And trust that God's justice is enough.
Yeah. Yeah. And be able to just leave it with, and just trust God. Lord, this is yours. It's not mine.
Yeah. Like, here's another practical example. My dad died suddenly, like right after I turned 24. And there are things that he said to me that I didn't see as harmful until like years after he passed, where I was like, oh man, that really sucked. I wish I could have like thought through that or responded differently. And I know that, like, definitely as a teenager, like, you say terrible things to your parents, you lie, you do all these things, where like I wasn't able to ask for forgiveness from my dad for things that I did. And so, but like, he's dead. I'm never going to be able to do that while I'm alive. But that doesn't mean I don't have hope. I could let that inability to ask for forgiveness or seek or like tell my dad like that hurt, I could let that eat me alive and seek vengeance on somebody or like be bitter against this person and let that control me. But my dad's dead. I can only control what's in front of me. I can't control that he's not here. I can't control how I look back and respond and relate to him and remember the honest relationship that we did have, the good and the bad, because that's what a full person is. We can't saint somebody or martyr somebody into perfection. Jesus is the only person who did that. We shouldn't do it to other people. But what is genuinely honest and like what real forgiveness looks like is seeing someone for who they are and knowing that God can forgive and will forgive, and there is justice in it, and that things can be improved in how I deal with those things. I'm trusting God to heal me in the ways that I couldn't because my dad's not here. So I have majority fond memories with my dad, but I know that everything wasn't like, worked out between the two of us. But I'm able to like move on. I'm able to process things and be honest about how things actually were, good and bad. So I'm trusting that God has that. So I know, I'm using that example where there are going to be guys who hear this that desperately want to repair a relationship, and it may just not happen. But that doesn't mean that God doesn't love you, that God doesn't want the best for you, that God doesn't want the best for that other person. Like, God's forgiveness fills the gaps in our relationships. God's grace does that. We shouldn't try to hold the tension that he already took care of. Because when we do that, we like overstep. We make things a lot worse and a lot messier because we're trying to be God, and we can't do that. That's just like, it's impossible. So why try?
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Relational Recovery Podcast. We'll be back soon with a new conversation. We'll see you then.